So last week we were talking about this mountaintop experience with God. Those times when churches and God's people and Christians catch spiritual lightning in a bottle. And we were talking about how those experiences are given so that when we come down off the mountain or the high spiritual place, that we can face our demons and we can face our doubts. And the higher purpose for that is so that we can fulfill the purposes that we live on this planet for, that we can become the people that we were born to be, and we can lean into that. You see, Jesus took Peter, James, and John to the top of a mountain for a private disclosure. He invited them, he gave them access to his prayer life. You talk about privileged access to be in the presence of greatness. Talk about minutes or moments. This was a moment. It was a powerful moment. And they were invited into this, and here's how it went down. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up into a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. Two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Can you imagine that prayer meeting? Can you soak that in? These men are suddenly in the presence of Moses and Elijah. There is this connection between that world and this world. I would call that a moment. They had the access of the privilege, but there was the moment when Jesus is communicating with the unseen world that's become seen before them. And not only so, but his body is so transformed, it's like flashing lightning. That's a moment. So why are we given sometimes access, and why are we given sometimes disclosures? I want you to listen carefully to Mark 10. What I tell you in the dark, speak in the daylight. What is whispered in your ear, proclaim from the rooftops or from the roofs. If we don't follow those nudges, those callings, those times to separate and go up to the mountain, if we don't lean into sometimes a moment that may be dressed the way that we don't understand, we could miss this part right here. For you to have a private disclosure, they're usually given in private places. To have something whispered into your ear in a private place, notice there's a purpose. He says, what I whisper to you in the dark or where others cannot see, that is a private disclosure to you, then I want you to go out. There will be a purpose for you then to go out and to speak that. And I can tell you it has life to it. Listen to this. Private disclosures are given for public ministry, and that word ministry means service. They're not given for our glory or our grandeur or our pride or our arrogance. They're given so that we might serve. We have men and women that have the highest clearances. One of the times I was with Bob at the Air Force Base, when you go in, they take your picture and they keep it there for 20 years. And, he took me into some 5-level top secret things, stuff had to be covered up in there that we couldn't see. Here's what I'm saying. My respect for those men and women that are on that level to protect us just grew exponentially from that experience. You see, Elijah and Moses came to talk with Jesus about his departure and how that would go down in Jerusalem. To talk about his death on the cross. To talk about him fulfilling his purpose. To talk about why he came into the world. And maybe those two pictures of those two men is Jesus is doing what the law couldn't do, and Jesus is going to fulfill what the prophets couldn't do, but he's going to bring the law and the prophets and to fulfill them. Jesus said this, if you had believed Moses, you would believe me because he spoke of me. Next week, right here, when you come, you're going to get a booklet already pre-made for you with all of the outlines for a series on the life of Moses. I'm going to do a series on Moses, the law, and then I'm going to do a series on Elijah, the prophet. And I'm going to pull it back down into the purpose of why Jesus came into the world. You're going to have a fill-in-the-blank outline. If you these messages are standalone, it means you'll be ministered to anytime you come in here. If you have to be out or you're traveling, you can catch it online. You can take that little booklet with you. It's free to you, and you can stay with me on this series. They came to talk to him about his death on the cross, how he would fulfill the law, Moses, and the prophets, Elijah. When Jesus left the mountain, he returned to the mission. When Jesus came off the mountain, he said nothing about the glory and the splendor and these guys coming from another world. Because the purpose wasn't to brag about whose presence you're in. The purpose was about the privilege of whose presence you're in and the purpose of why you're there. Luke 9 says it this way, listen carefully, Jesus said, to what I'm about to tell you. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. This should have came as no surprise to them, because 8 days before this, Jesus said this to them. Then he said, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed on the third day and be raised to life. When Jesus leaves the mountain, he returns to the mission. But if you and I are not careful, when we come down from the mountain, when we come from the moment, when we come from places of privilege that have a purpose, we can then use those for our own purposes. Churches do this kind of stuff all the time. They get in what I call a holy huddle. They have a move of God, and God begins to bless the ministry that they're doing, and people begin to come, and there's lightning in a bottle, and it's electrifying, and it's beautiful. And then they begin to get into a holy huddle. And you ever notice that if there's a football huddle on the field, and if you come up, they can block you out? Sometimes we take these experiences and we make the huddle with that, and instead of moving on to the purpose, we want to stay with the experience, and that's what Peter wanted to do. We talked about that last week. He said, it's good for us to be here. Let's make a tabernacle for one for Moses, one for Elijah, and one for you. In other words, let's build a monument to men, and let's stay right here because this just feels so good. You know, we can do that. We can go try to live on the mountain, and who cares about the community? If we're not careful, or if we stay on the mountain and if we build monuments to men, we will not only compete with ourselves, but we will compete with others. So What happens here is they begin to compete with themselves, or we can compete with ourselves. Jesus is praying to die for the sins of the world. And what are the disciples doing? They're jockeying for position. He's told them the Son of Man's going to die. He's made it clear to them. He's taken them up onto the mountain with the law and the prophets speaking to him and telling him about his departure and what's going to happen in Jerusalem. And they're in that moment. But when they get down from that moment, what happens is they begin to compete. How many have kids that are old enough to sit in the front seat? Right? So when you're getting ready to go to somewhere, if you have one or two or more kids that are old enough to sit in the front seat, what do? I got shotgun. Right? You want that seat, right? You want to be up front. It's kind of a rite of passage. It's kind of an privileged access because you've always had to sit in the back seat until you get old enough that you can sit in the front seat. And I think a lot of times when God begins to do things in our life, what we want to do is we want the front seat. We want the front seat. And while Jesus, listen to this, Jesus says to him, an argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. So they come down off of this mountain, and then this argument starts. Who's the greatest? Who's got front seat? They had front seat syndrome. And if you and I are not careful, when we come down from the mountain, we will elevate position over people. And we'll compete with ourselves. And we'll get in that holy huddle. And then, if we're not careful, if we stay on the mountain, as I said, we build monuments, we'll not only compete with ourselves, we'll not only have front seat syndrome, but we will then begin to confine the service of outsiders. When you begin to have front seat syndrome, no, I'm first. Where does that lead? Then it leads to them pushing others out, making that holy huddle and not letting anyone else in. No sooner had Jesus corrected them for their positioning that they went straight to elitism and limiting others. Master John said, we saw one driving out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he's not, there it is, one of us. Right there at that moment, the disciples were in danger of becoming keepers of the aquarium instead of fishers of men. Right there in that moment, they were missing the moment, and they could have missed their destiny to do great things for God, the calling that they had when Jesus first gathered them on the seaside. Listen to Jesus' answer. Do not stop him, Jesus said. For whoever is not against you is for you. Carbon, let's not be exclusive, but let's be inclusive. Amen. Let's be in the foxhole for the whole church, not just our church. Let's give these chairs to the church across the road that can't afford these chairs. Let's be in the foxhole for the whole church, not just our church. Amen. You know, when we start competing with ourselves and we start confining the ministry of others, what the danger is, then it leads to condemning others. This is what it leads to. So what happens here in the story is Jesus sends some of the disciples ahead into some Samaritan villages. And when they get there, he said, go prepare for me to get there. And when they get there, the villages say, we don't want you here. We don't want Jesus here. So watch this. And when the disciples, James and John, saw this, they asked, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy them? Come on, Jesus, let's just fry them. You want us to just go totally nuclear on this group? Let's just blast them. But Jesus turned and rebuked them. And another text says, you do not know what spirit you are of. You see, when you start arguing among yourselves, when you do a holy huddle and you push other people out, where that leads to is eventually you will condemn others. And by condemning, I mean these people deserve death. They're not one of us. They need to just move on. You see, when churches become limiters and elitists, what happens is a lot of times where churches begin to fall apart and begin to die is they get here. They start out with this access to God. They start out with this moment that turns into a mission, that turns into a purpose, and then they begin to infight and they begin to do all that and they do the holy huddle. And before you know it, they're saying things like this: nobody's got that doctrine down like we do. We got that doctrine, honey. We got it down. We got it down. Nobody knows that Bible like we do. We're the elitist, purest truth in town. And then about 4 or 5 people are sitting there and they're closing the doors. We can do that in families. We can do it in a marriage. We can do it in a home. When you're always right. And when you argue people wrong ad nauseum, pretty soon you're going to be sitting in an empty house. No one's always right. We can't put ourselves on God level. We're here to serve the whole community and the whole body of Christ. And the humbler we stay about that, and the more curious we stay about that, and the more that we see an adventure in that, and the more that we empower others, we can stay on mission. It can be an amazing thing. Another thing that happens if we're not careful when we come down from spiritual experiences of the mountain, we ease back into our comfort zones. And the call of the mountain is just a faint memory of glory days gone by. It used to be that way, but we can't capture that ever again. Here's what I want to tell you. I want to tell you that when you come down off the mountain, whether it's your salvation experience, whether it's just a revival or a blessing or, just family life and beauty and all the things that happen, when those things are going on, you don't need permission for the mission. You've already been anointed. You don't need my permission to love someone in this community. You don't need my permission to be generous. You don't need my permission to be kind. You don't have to have a list of 5 do's and don'ts for Carbon Church to go out there and to be a blessing and to care for one another and to care for others. We just need to see a need and meet it. Because sometimes there's a moment happening and we don't know what that connection is, but I just want to encourage you today that when those connections come, when you have that sense, I really want to get to know this person. There may be more to that meeting than you could ever dream of.